Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And thank you very, very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone's seeing the screen okay. And thank you all for being here on another beautiful Sunday afternoon. And as we all know, we have nothing else to do except to bring peace and prosperity to this planet. And so let us, one second, let us begin. So this is part of the Keshe American Knowledge Team meeting, which is a very important meeting, which is why I want to thank everybody for participating here, because we have representation from all the continents around the world. As we follow through on every Thursday, we have the main session that goes around the world, and then on Friday, the Brazilian session. And then, of course, this is our session to try and contribute what we can. And so this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, Teachings on Plasma Science. We are in the Intermediate Inertia series. Today, we'd like to discuss consistency. My name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is March the 2nd of 2025. This is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education series. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to distill the knowledge in such a way that each and every one of us has an opportunity to explain it, first of all, to ourselves, and then to our near group of acquaintances, and to prepare ourselves to bring in the rest, because this is a worldwide and I won't say it's a worldwide movement. This is a worldwide necessity, and it has to do with peace and prosperity and our ability to deliver that. And why not? What is wrong with that, if that is the true intention? And so here we are on the Hesitancy Highway, and we say, well, on this particular highway, we're operating at the lowest energy state. However, this lowest energy state has accumulated the most energy and has come down into the containment of the physicality. And so with this understanding, we're at the frontier crossroads now. And, you know, we love our chuck wagon tailgate parties, and we really depend on those field goal kickers. to turn us into winners. And the San Francisco 49ers, remember the gold rush, is now what it's all about. We want to get that, and we're searching for that because it's our little tiny perfect world. Well, what we have to search for is our way into outer space. And of course, we need to have security in order to do that. So the fact of the matter is the universe guarantees the security on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And we know that is true because we're here. And the rest of the universe is allowing that to happen. And so the rest of the universe is there. So that guarantee is already in place. And so we're describing as best as we can the books of Marantava Kolikash as they come in book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter. And if your comment might be that, we keep repeating and repeating and repeating, we only repeat for a short period every week. For the rest of the week, we're inundated with knowledge that each and every one of us has discovered is wanting in one way or another. And so each and every one of us has to discover the new universal order of the creation of matter. Because now what we have to see is that we have to take into context other things. So yes, we're familiar with our matter state of physicality, but there's also the dark matter and the antimatter and how those interact. And if they interact, then there is an energy and information that is coming from somewhere, and it needs a vehicle. So we look at the structure of the light. And it is a structure, isn't it? Because the light is carrying this knowledge. And if it's carrying it, it's obviously making a delivery. And we all know that delivery has to come from somewhere and go somewhere. And if you're sending the delivery, then it's coming from you. And if you're receiving the delivery, then it's coming to you. But either way, one side has to communicate with the other side. So what is the other side? And so we see in book number 3, The Origin of the Universe. And isn't that nice? We can order the universe and by our delivery service. And in that process, we get our little tiny perfect universe. But we find that there's a sister universe that somehow seems to be more abundant. And so what is stopping us from sharing these universes? So we see for 367 weeks, the One Planet, One Nation, One Race for Justice and World Peace, brought to you by Rick Crammon and the Universal Council. And we see the limitations of the Universal Council is not just earthbound. And so the Universal Council means universal. And universal means beyond our Earth space. Because if it was just our Earth space, then it wouldn't be the Universal Council, it would be the Earth Space Council. So we have to understand that. It's just like the United Nations. The United Nations is uniting the nations from the Earth. What do we define as a nation? Aren't all these nations members of the Earth? So we are just one group of members of the Universal Council. So we have to be governed by rules because we are misbehaviors. So we need to have guidelines. And so we had the 10 Commandments of Moses that told us what not to do. And then we found another 14 commandments, which also told us what not to do. And so we have a complete case of 24, which is very good. because we need to have this knowledge to tell us what not to do. So our life is complete. Except that there's another highway out there, the plasma highway, and it's operating at a higher energy level. And it has different characteristics, different properties. And these are different properties from where we are. We're on the transmission highway. And this transmission highway, of course, involves frequency. And as a result of that frequency, it's at the lowest energy state. And so we say it's a result of the frequency, or is it the frequency is a result of? And what is it a result of? It's a result of what has happened at the transition highway. And the transition highway is appropriately the highway that has been between the higher state and the lower energy state. And so there are on-ramps and off-ramps. And one of those ramps can take us to the transmutation highway. So this is the overriding question is, well, where exactly is this transmutation highway? And, you know, maybe this is part of the carbon inertia highways, because there's a carbon connection to all of these highways. So this is like in Canada, we have the King's Highway, and like in the United States, we have the interstate highways. Well, in the universe, we have the carbon inertia highways. And so there we go. So now we know about these highways. Does anyone have a map? And one of the things that we have to figure out is how we come together with these highways. So when we were discussing surface to volume ratios, we found that we were missing one of the things that we need, because we were the observers. And what were we observing? So we were observing the three feeding dimensions. And as a result, we got an answer, and that is the fourth feedback dimension. But let's remember, the feeding dimensions are still there. So which dimension do we belong to? So part of the thing is that the feeding dimensions are still there, and that's part of our belief. And so what we experience is we experience our beliefs. And so that's how we get the feedback. And how do we know that we experience our beliefs? And how do we know that the experience is part of the feedback dimension? Well, because when we don't know something, we tend to fudge it. But the thing is, what we see is what we observe. And so what we observe is actually part of the feedback. And so we can give that feedback and say, well, this is what I experienced. And as a result of that experience, and this is what I believe. So you continue feeding that. Not realizing, of course, that we experience our beliefs. So in order to make the opposite true, we kind of have to fudge things, don't we? So we really are part and parcel of the continuation of this understanding and acceptance. And so it's correct to ask, is our understanding and acceptance correct? What is correct is that we are the observers, and what we're observing is part of our feedback, and it's affecting what we term is our reality. So if we're looking at the carbon inertia highways, and if we're looking at the maps of North America, there are many highways. So we never did state which highway. We just called it the carbon inertia highway. And so we have different numbers of highways. Well, we have different numbers of carbon as well. And we have touched on discussing carbon highways from 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. And of course, there are some smaller highways in between. And they're not shown here. But the thing about it is that we're not sure if we can go from one highway to another highway within the same energy state, or can we switch energy states and go from one highway in one energy state to another highway in another energy state? And then how do we determine that? And since this is all we see, well, what we don't see is on the other side. And so there's a convergence of those carbon inertia highways. And so the question is, what is the limitation of our vision? What is the limitation of our observation? And why are we asking so many questions? And why didn't we ask them before, when we were students? Right? Because it wasn't important. So what we're talking about now is less important? Are we nickel and diming ourselves? Or are we at the plasma inertia junctions? And which junction is it? If we were able to transition from one energy state to another state, then there has to be a transition state in between, what we call a transfer state. But in order to achieve that, we have to have the transition matter state and the transfer state, and that becomes the one track, and then we go to another track. And so we could have a high inertia junction, but we could also have a medium inertia junction. And well, let's keep going. We could also have a low inertia junction. So there's no real reason here why we have an inertia either lower or higher from what our observation tells us. And so maybe we guess at it. Or maybe what we have to understand is that in all cases, there is an inertia junction. And just because we are maintaining one viewpoint, maybe there's another viewpoint. And how do we decide which one? And then how do we decide that that's the one? And that's not accounted for in it. The only thing that we account for is the fact that we know that in order to make a reference, you have to reference to something. And then you have to reference from something as opposed to something else. So the energy transfer then becomes part of the conservation of energy, doesn't it? And the conservation of energy follows the rules of the conservation of inertia. And that becomes then manifested to the MAGRAPH energy transfer state. And so we know that this is true because we've seen a difference from the atomic state, the nanostate, and the GaN state. But the thing is that when we set this up, we only had two states. And in fact, before we even started with that, we only had the one state. Well, if we decide to start with one state and bring in a second state and then materialize a third state, there is no accounting as which is the first state and which is the other state, because it could be the first state, and which is the combination state, and which reference of combination are we referencing to? And so, oh dear, we have many, many choices. And there's nothing here that tells us why one choice would be more susceptible than another, except to say that, well, there is a difference. And so what is missing is the consistency. When we say the consistency, the Knowledge Seekers workshops come every week consistently. The One Nation workshops come together consistently. The Brazilian team broadcasts consistently, and so does the North American team. And there are many parallel teams working consistently. So we have a balance of understanding where some people talk about consistency actually being chaotic. And so there is a consistency of the chaotic environment. And for some of us, we think that's normal. So if it is chaotic, if it is without reason, then the reason becomes random, because there's no particular reason for something to happen chaotically with any consistency. So in order for something to manifest consistently, it has to have a consistency. But when the consistency is chaotic, then the chance of it manifesting consistently is really very random. And so what is the factor that's at play here? Because it's not shown. And so we see that there is a religious consistency. We see that there's a scientific consistency. And of course, what is near and dear to our hearts is the practical consistency. So what is important for us in a consistent manner is what is practical for us. So can we bring this scientific knowledge in such a manner where there's a practical application that all of us can relate to? Because there is one thing that is consistent about all of us, is that we're dependent on the practical application in our earth space here. And so what we all need to really know, and what really matters to us, is what is the factor that is at play. Because we all want some kind of stability in our life, and of course, we would like to have security. So there is a security in the universe because the way the universe is created. It exists from energy, and that energy is always positive. So the charge has nothing to do with its positivity or negativity. It has to do with its motion, because the energy is always in motion. And so if it's motion, it means it's coming to or going from. And so when we look at the universal order of creation of matters, we see that, well, wait a second, the matter state is a combination of matter, dark matter, and antimatter, which means it's energy coming together. But this energy that's coming together is all of different energy states. And so if it's of different energy states, is it all coming from the same place? In other words, how can different energy states come from the same place, or do all of these energy states come from different places? But if these different places are part of the creation of matter, then they themselves would have to have a convergence of energy of different energy states. So it becomes a moot point, doesn't it? If you're saying, do these energy states all come from different places, when all the different places have the same requirements? So therefore, there's no accounting for saying that a certain energy state comes from a certain location. It's just talk. And that's what we're doing here. We're just talking and trying to figure out, well, wait a second. Everything that matters to us in the practicality is in the physical energy state, but now we have to acknowledge that it can come from somewhere else. So when these energies come together, we always see when things come together, it becomes a point of conflict. But in the plasma rule, that point of conflict could be a binding zone. And in that binding zone, instead of having a conflict where the higher strength eats the weaker strength, we have a binding zone where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And so this binding energy is obviously very important for us in our own self-serving needs because it gives us our physicality. And then so we've achieved this energy binding by the coming together of all of these energies from somewhere or other. And if we don't know where that comes from, maybe we should ask the carrot. But if the carrot is dangling at the end of the stick, and then you have to chase the carrot holding the stick, that becomes exhausting. So it's much easier to steal it from someone, isn't it? Take that energy binding that we need and take it from someone else at their expense. Makes it easier for us. But now they were depending on that energy binding. So what have we done? We put them in our league of requiring the energy binding in a self-serving manner, but at the expense of others. Well, who are those others? Well, it could be us. It could be the person you robbed. Now they want to rob you back. It could be the person you're at war with. Now that they want to war back. It could be the person that you abused. Maybe they're in no position to abuse back. But does that mean there's no penalty? So we have a delay in consequences in our physicality, which allows us to contemplate that. And so in that process, we develop, and it's amazing that a lot of people subscribe to this chaos theory, and they live that way. And is that really what life is? Is life chaotic? So we understand that something manifests as something. But something can manifest as something else. So which something does it manifest into, and what is determining that? Well, if we depend on a chaotic life, then we can say the chaotic manifestation is random, which means that the random manifestation would be accidental. But why would something manifest as something as opposed to something else? So that something needs to be predetermined by a selection, and that is not shown. So this chaotic life then becomes a random selection. And it gets reduced to the lowest common denominator, which means that the chaotic life becomes a magic trick. And isn't this what the magician says? Pick a card, any card will do. Yeah, random picking. So, what is randomness? And how does it apply if our life is chaotic? Or is life consistent? Because something is something for a reason, and therefore something is something else, but for another reason can't be something else for the same reason. If the reason is the same, then something is something. But if it's another reason, then it has to be something else. So whichever something it is, it has to be predetermined by a reason. So something is consistently predetermined. So therefore, life becomes chaotic by consistently ignoring the reason. And so we become short order cooks. And just because we know the recipe implies the consistency of the meal. But is that the only factor? Because the reproduction of that meal has embedded energies. So the quality of that meal is dependent on who is the chef. So when we talk about consistency in the physical state, polymers are very consistent. They consistently reproduce. They reproduce in a chain and keep reproducing in a chain or a matrix. And if there's a reason, that reason would be in the chain replication of the plasma state. Because the reasons in the plasma state and the manifestation from the plasma state manifests into the chain replication. But there's a different kind of chain. We call it the protein. And so we know that proteins can consistently reproduce. If you've ever had an accident, maybe scraped your knee, you've damaged your skin, which is protein, and it repairs itself consistently. So cells can repair themselves. And it's done consistently. So we have a polymeric consistent reproduction, and we have a protein consistent reproduction. Two different somethings must be two different reasons. that reason must be embedded in the plasma state. So in our discussion of the relationships is dependent on the tensity of the containment. So in order for us to have a maggrav, it has to be in balance. So what we say, the magnetical and gravitational field forces. So we look at the scientific community, and they have a balance between the conservation of magnetic fields and the conservation of energy. And then we look at the spiritual community, and they have a balance between the spirituality and the soul state. And then, of course, the rest of us are trying to figure out what is the practical application of this, because most of the time what we give credence to is the awake state, and what we disregard and discount is the dream state. And so this is where the plasma state and the plasma science comes in, because it adds to the knowledge. And so by adding to the knowledge, we can affect the rate of change, because the rate of change is different. And what are the reasons for that to be different? So we, as part of our creation, which they call us the four-wheelers, because we're mobile, but to be more mobile, we get into vehicles. And so that becomes part of our environment. So that becomes our natural creation. But it has to be balanced off by the natural decay. But if we say that that is something, then what is the factor? And so we see that there's an inertia bonding factor. And that's our point of view, isn't it? Because we're the observers. So the bonding factor, and we like to apply our reasons to it. So if we don't really understand the reason, then we have to kind of fudge things. And so we become the bonding fudge factor, which is telling us the reason, which is balanced off by the natural decay, which of course is balanced off by the natural creation on the other side. And so in order to create this balance, we have a maggrav on one side and a maggrav on the other side, and the balance between the two overall create a maggrav of the four-wheelers of creation. That's what we are. And so there's a magnetical dependency. So when we talk about the attraction, these are gravitational field forces of intensity, but they're part of the feedback. It's the repulsion of the magnetical forces of the outtensity that is part of the feeding. And so each one of these is represented atomically as either an electron or a neutron. And I'm sure you can see the difference here. And of course, it also depends on which way you're looking. I can see the difference. Can you see the difference? And then, of course, we have hard dimension. That's the dimension that we choose, right? Because that's our matter state plasma, and that's our matter state inertia. Except that it's a matter state of physicality. And isn't it funny? It gives us gravitational stability, but the chickens and the cows and the fish and the vertical people all have the same selection dimension by the same criteria. What's the difference? So we see them eat, and we want them to eat lots, right? So that we can raise them so that we can eat them. So there's a consistent chain of events there, isn't it? And then, of course, we have a contention for this planet. We depend on this planet. But since our humanity civilization has all these different humanities, these different civilizations. Or maybe we should call them the uncivilizations, because we all seem to be at war. And we all seem to have our own prejudice. So naturally, our own self-serving needs are our prejudicial source, prejudicial choice. And if it is in conflict with your prejudicial choice, then we may end up at war. And that's not very civilized, is it? And then we were forced to introduce the cups of life. The warmongers did that. And this was our response. We didn't call it the cup of the warmongers, or we didn't call it the cup of the lockdowns. We called it the cup of life. And it wasn't just one cup. This was a reflection of our understanding of the monatomic science and how it affected our inner space. And we were able to manifest ganses like copper, calcium, zinc, and copper, water, amino acid, but these are all molecular structures. In other words, bringing elements together, more than one, makes a molecule. And so these ganses became a radiance manifestation. And of course, the shiniest one is gold. We like it because it glitters. But what we really like is the manifestation of the physicality, because we need to be fed. So if the rules of feeding the cows and chickens, etc., are the same as the rules that feed us, then why do we need them to feed us? Why do we need them to satisfy our hunger? And what are we hungry for? So we have a duality to take care of. Part is the physical structure and part is the emotional structure. And we see that in the cup of man. But then we introduce the soul, and it's still the cup of the man, except now it's extended to the cup of the soul. And all three come together into this one field. But that field is different from what we see as the cup of the universe, which involves our mind. And when we look at our mind, we say it's a mind, a brain, but it has two sides, a left and a right side, just like the cups of life. And so the brain gets fed. And the feeding of the brain gets a feedback from the physicality. And of course, we're the observers. So are we observing from our brain, or are we observing from our physical body? Well, of course, the truth is the brain is a physical part of the body. So the answer is yes and yes. And so that doesn't say anything. That doesn't really give us the reason, except to understand that there's another factor to take into account, and that's the physicality of the earth. So in order for us to interact with the physicality of the earth, which is beyond the physicality of the man, isn't it? So we have the brain interacting with, and in such a manner to have the inertia of the mind manifest into the physicality of the man. And then the inertia of the mind has to interact with the physicality of the earth. And so that intermediary becomes the soul of the physicality. And the soul of the physicality is the inertia manifestation of the inertia of the mind. And it, in combination with the inertia of the mind and the inertia of the physicality of the earth, manifests into the physicality of the man. And that is a sequence that is very, very important because you can't go nowhere. You can only go somewhere. And so the earth had to be here first. And in order for the earth to be here first, it had to produce ganses. And the reason it had to do that was because it has to manifest in physicality. So the ganses became a representation of that physicality. And they're all different, except that they're all part of the earth. So we have a sentimental pie in the sky. We call it Earth. And that's where we are, somewhere. And we determine that not by being somewhere. We had to determine that by going somewhere where we're not. So we were not Venus, we're not Mars. So we're part of the Earth. And we rotate around the sun, as does Venus, as does Mars. In fact, all the planets rotate around the sun, and we all maintain a position that is consistent through the rotation and every subsequent rotation. And this is good. So if our planets are working like electrons, then can we say that the sun is our neutron? And if the sun were to be our neutron, then for those on Jupiter, they would say the same thing. Their sun is their neutron. And what about those from Neptune? Well, their sun is also their neutron. But their sun is our sun. So what's the factor? So we have to look at what happens with the neutron. And so we see that there's atomic dependency because we know that there are different atoms. And yet we describe each atom the same way, very consistently. There's a neutron, there's a proton, there's an electron, but in the plasma science, there's also a PM tick. And what's very interesting is that if we're talking about a charge, which is the charge in motion, and that has to be a relationship that is dependent. So if we look at the surface of the volume of the PM tick, we find it's the smallest. So that has the highest negative charge. And it has the highest negative charge compared to everything here. But then if we look at the atom, which is a combination of electron proton, then we find that the electron has a higher surface to volume ratio than the proton. So the electron is negative, the proton is positive. But if we look at the combination, which is an atom, and compare that to the neutron, then we could see that the atom is a negative charge and the neutron is positive. But here comes the anomaly. Opposite poles attract. And yet, here we have the creation of the universe exemplified with the neutron breaking up into an electron-proton combination and a PM tick. So it's a separation. It's an opposition. It's opposite to what we understand. So, like, what's the factor that's causing this? So, when we talk about elemental protons, we find that each element has a different number of protons. Oh my, here's a little complication. And with the number of protons, we can add the number of neutrons. But in the absence of a neutron, is the atomic number the neutron? Or in the absence of a neutron, is a proton a neutron? But then the question is, can an element exist without a neutron? Well, according to the explanation of what an atom is, which is an electron-proton combination, then the answer would be yes. So when we look at the periodic table of prejudice, we see that each number represents an element, and the number of that element is represented by the number of protons. But then we find that it doesn't always have a one-to-one relationship from protons to neutrons. It does in the lower ranks, but it doesn't in the higher ranks. But what we've had to accept is that all of the elements have a neutron because that affects the mass, doesn't it? Except for the hydrogen, it doesn't have a neutron. So we have had to make a concession in the periodic table and say, we are not going to organize this by the number of neutrons. We're going to organize it by the number of protons. But then what we have to say is that the minimum of proton is the consistent aspect of the atomic detail. But if we were to say that you really cannot exist without a neutron, then we would have to assign a different number, which is to say all of the elements on the periodic table of elements have a neutron except for one. So do we kowtow to that one? Or do we say, well, the periodic table is a democracy and everybody has a neutron, and if you don't have a neutron, you don't have a mass, or you don't deserve to be on the periodic table? Or if we are going to count that as our gravitational part, then we have to say, just a moment, maybe the hydrogen doesn't occupy the number one position. It would occupy the zero position. But, we fudge things kind of. So we say, well, there's a hydrogen that it kind of doesn't have a neutron. And then we have a hydrogen that does occupy the number one position because that keeps the Earth space range details consistent. And so this becomes a bit of a problem when we look at, in the beginning, how the neutron came before the atom. So if the hydrogen atom only has electron-proton, then that would make sense. Because from the neutron comes the hydrogen atom and a PM tick. And so we use that to explain how we came from the darkness. And so we say, well, let there be light. Yes. And so the light comes by the PM ticks, which are magnetical, right? And they converge into the maggrav state of the principal transition matter and convergence matter and convert itself to a plasma state, which of course is only in the plasmagen state and not in the physical state until it interacts with the field state of the Earth space, and then interacting becomes a field interaction, which we call inertia, establishing a gravitational maggrav field that we call, well, we call that our life, isn't it? So this is part of our makeup of the matter plasma dimension. And this is how we can account and kind of say, well, look, there is a physical state because we can touch it and see it. We call that the gravitational feedback system. But there's a plasmatic state, which is part of the magnetical feeding system, because we can't touch it and we can't see it. But, you know, since we are fed and we have the feedback and we're the observers, we are observing what we want to observe. And so we make that choice. And so we become feedback dominant. Forgetting is where things come from. And then we have the anomaly of the positron, which we said last week is the antiparticle of an electron. It has all the properties of an electron except for the polarity. So the polarity of the electrical charge, which is positive. And therefore, a positron can simply be considered an electron having a positive unit electrical charge. Wow. So looking at the atomic mass, we said that the neutron to proton ratio is variable. So therefore, the neutron mass is variable. We know the proton mass is variable because we can add it incrementally by integer. That's a unit of number. And it's sequential. But in the case of the hydrogen, when is the neutron a proton? Or when is a proton a neutron? Is that the better question? Or the electron mass we know is also different because it's affected by the neutron. But when is an electron a positron? Because they're interchangeable, aren't they? So when we're looking at the core dependency, I would say, okay, well, we have electron and we know it's magnetical, and we have a neutron, we know it's gravitational, but there's no accounting to say why one is magnetical and one is gravitational. And there's no accounting to say, well, what's an electron and what's a positron? And there's no accounting to say what's a neutron and what's a proton. But what we do say is there's a combination of three energy states of matter, antimatter, and dark matter. So there's no reason for it to change. And so we're the observer, and so we can make an arbitrary decision, right? And we can just say whatever suits our fancy and fudge it our way so that it comes out that we understand what we're talking about. But what we do know is that there's an inner space containment, and that containment is based on the tensity of the creation of the maggrav. So in order for a maggrav to exist, it has to have a maggrav state plus a magnetical, and it has to be balanced off by a maggrav state plus the gravitational. And so the out tensity has to be balanced off by the intensity. So the out tensity is part of the emission, and the intensity is part of the absorption. And so the balance of what we emit and what we absorb is the inertia of the neutron. That becomes part of our inner space containment. And we have a gravitational confirmation of that because, well, let there be light. And then here comes the color that we see in the hydrogen, which is part of the emission spectrum. And it's a unique fingerprint. And in this emission spectrum, we see all the colors except for the colors that the hydrogen absorbs. We don't see those colors. And in fact, it's the same is true with the oxygen. And so this gravitational confirmation, of course, is all the magnetical force fields coming together from the sun, from the earth, and from the universe. And in order to manifest these colors, we have to have a spectrum dependency depending on what we're looking at. Are we looking at the absorption spectrum or are we looking at the emission spectrum? So in order to understand the uniqueness of the fingerprint in the absorption spectrum, what we don't see is what it is. In the emission spectrum, what we do see is what it is. And that is true for carbon. It has an absorption spectrum and an emission spectrum, perfectly aligned, but opposite, where the absorption and the emission are two different spectra. Oxygen has the same thing. So we can choose one or the other, but we have to understand that the fingerprint is actually the true identification of the atomic structure. And the atomic structure includes more than just one. But if we look at the basic hydrogen dependency, we find that the gases all come together in pairs. That's true of nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. And then when we look at the nature, the properties of the hydrogen, we find that it can be orthohydrogen or it can be parahydrogen. And the parahydrogen involves a flipping of one of the poles of the hydrogen. And so our original question, can common poles attract? Well, they repel. So opposite poles attract. But if they repel on one side, then they repel on the other side. And if they attract on one side, then they attract on the other side. So we can see a straight line. And so when we look at us as organic beings, we find that when we look at the nature of us, which is essential fatty acids, we find that they're made in chains. And the question that's on the mind is, well, how do these chains bond together? And so there has to be some kind of attraction. And that attraction is based on the pole flipping. And we know that to be true because when we look at the Ganser connection of water, we find that the two hydrogen repel each other to a certain degree. And the hydrogen is a gas. And the oxygen is a gas. But when we add the two together, we get water. And the water quenches fire. And as we said, there was a time when we know because hydrogen is lighter than air, that we used it to make airships. But, they burn in the presence of oxygen. But if we take that oxygen and combine it with carbon as carbon dioxide, then that quenches the fire. But the difference is carbon dioxide is heavier than air and hydrogen is lighter than air. So there's an energy implied in the essential fatty acids. And so we call them aliphatic hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons. Hydro means water. So we have these straight connections, but there are bent connections. These are not aliphatic, they're called aromatic, right? Because of the way they link up. So the aromatic compounds are cyclic molecules that contain alternating single and double bonds. So they have to bend. They have no choice. And so that becomes part of our cell membranes. All cells have membranes, and the membranes are made of fatty acids. But the fatty acids are chains of carbon aliphatic molecules, meaning that the poles are flipped. And as a result, they're highly elastic and even fluidic. And this is a good thing. Because we like to be able to move around, and we like our food to be chewable and digestible, and so we look at the combination of the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen being part of our amino acids. And so we're not only four-wheelers, but we're also amino foodies. We like to eat. We like our livestock to eat, our crops. We like them to eat, and then we like to eat them. So there's a containment dependency on all of these. But when we look at the nature and the signature of the hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, we can only detect them when they come together. But each has an individual fingerprint. That fingerprint gets lost. That individual fingerprint gets lost when we bring them all together. Except now, if we introduce this positron, and it's part of the potassium 40 decay that releases a positron, so the electron's antimatter twin. So we also contain a small amount of antimatter. I can't say if this is true. I haven't counted. We produce 4,000 positrons per day. It's 180 per hour. Doesn't seem to be very productive. I don't know. But we do know that bananas are a source of antimatter. That's because the bananas contain a tiny amount of radioactive form of potassium. So as it decays, it produces positrons. So that's the antimatter counterpart of electrons. And so whether it's an anti-electron, what we call a positron, it would also repel the proton since it has a positive charge. So the electron repels the proton. The positron repels the proton. So if the electrons are energy in motion and the positrons are energy in motion, then they're mathematically equivalent to electrons moving backwards in time. But, are we moving forward in time or backwards in time when we have both electrons and positrons, and do they balance each other out? Well, obviously, we have more electrons than positrons, according to the previous disclosure, so we're moving forward. But the thing is, we also have a cellular consistency. The cells regenerate consistently. The organelles regenerate consistently. Organs regenerate consistently. So the regeneration is targeted consistently. And if you don't know, the nose knows. When you scratch your knee, the knee cells get repaired, and then you scratch your nose, the nose cells get repaired. So it's a bullseye when you lock in on the target. And so that becomes part of the plasma chain. But that plasma chain then comes together in the gravitational neutron, which is a balance between the intensity and the external intensity. The internal maintaining a pressure. Because if it didn't maintain that pressure, it would collapse. So there has to be a plasma chain consistency. So we have the gravitational neutron, but it's balanced by the out-density interaction. Then we got the helium, and that's a stable isotope of the element helium. And it consists of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. And we find that its use as a gas is causing a gas dependency, where the NASA uses helium to generate, to keep hot gases and ultra-cold liquid fuel separated. This is important during liftoff of rockets. Arc welding also uses helium to create an inert gas shield. So, and underwater divers and others working under pressure can use a mix of helium and oxygen to create a safe artificial breathing atmosphere, right? Because the maximum amount of hydrogen that you want in that atmosphere is 21%. So we'd like to stay within the 18 to 21% range. And so the helium can make that up. And so the problem with gases, of course, is they take up all the space that you allow. And so when you mix these things, they have a consistency. And the thing about the helium is it doesn't blend with the oxygen. It maintains its structure. It maintains its fingerprint. And so if you were looking at a helium-oxygen mixture and you wanted to see its fingerprint, you could clearly see the overlapping of the spectrum of the helium with the spectrum of the oxygen. So if the gas of the oxygen were to expand into its environment, and the gas of the helium were to expand into its environment, how does the helium maintain its consistency? And how does the oxygen maintain its consistency when the two of them are overlapping within the same field of containment? So we've seen that there's a transmutation black hole, if you will, because in the physicality, the helium is at one point on the scale. That's magnetical because it has a atomic number of 2, and oxygen is gravitational, has an atomic number of 8. And yet, when you bring them together, they maintain their consistency within that containment. So there must be something that is balancing that containment, because they're both overlapping within the same field. and we don't see what that is. Well, frankly, we don't even see what the gas is until we do a spectroscopy. So what are these factors? Well, there has to be a consistent spectrum. But we can have a consistent spectrum in different locations. And then in a consistent location, we can have different spectra manifested. So this becomes kind of confusing. So neither the spectrum and neither the location is a factor. What is consistent is the manifestation. And this manifestation can be in different locations and in different bodies. So there is a consistent factor, but this consistent factor contributes to the changeable properties. And it's not shown here, is it? But it is demonstrated with a susceptibility to where we can see that we can go from different energy states like the atomic state, nanostate, and GAN state, or we can go in the physical matter to the plasmatic matter. And then we're just the observers. And then we have to figure out, well, which dimension are we observing? Because we're in the fourth dimension and we can only get to choose 3. And so in the majority of cases, we only choose the physical dimensions. And we say, well, that's what we see is what we get. But the truth of the matter is that the physicality is part of the gravitational neutron, which comes together from the physicality inertia. But that physicality inertia is part of the gravitational neutron of the inertia field. And that gravitational neutron is also part of the plasma inertia. And that gravitational neutron is also part of the humanity inertia. Oh my God. So here we are as the observer dimension. We have 4 different dimensions that we can choose to observe. And how do we know which one to choose? And which one is the one that is the factor? Well, the factor is that we are the gravitational confirmation. We are here as a result of the light. So and say, let there be light, well, let there be humanity. We are the gravitational trackers of the energy coming from the sun, the earth, and the universe. So if that is the case, and then we see the manifestation of energy in different sequences, starting at the lowest energy state, which is magnetic, and then goes to electric, and then electromagnetic, and atomic, and higher to nuclear, and higher to plasma. And we have the soul of the body and the soul of the man. And well, this is good. So this is our little staircase to heaven, I guess. But, we can jump the steps, and it's a two-way street. So as we said, we have the natural creation and the natural decay, which has to do with the maggrav plus the magnetical and the maggrav plus the gravitational. And so we have an emission and we have an absorption and we have a balance, and we can go in either way, but we don't have the factor here. And we know that the Earth space had to go through a transmutation state to bring together these 3 dimensions of the X, Y, and Z axis. And it had to be here before us. And so the Earth space came from outer space. And in order to have these 3 dimensions, it had to have a factor to manifest these 3 states. And so there was a consistency, the X and the Y, Z axis. And if the Earth space came from the outer space transmutation state, well, so did we. It's just that the Earth space had to be here first. So where did it come from? And now that we're here, well, where did we come from? And did we come from the same place? Because our fingerprint is different from the Earth space fingerprint. Or is it? Are we finding that all the elements of the periodic table are within our physicality as well? So in order to move somewhere, there has to be a substitution, that is a transference of the gravitational dominance. So at that point of substitution, the intensity has to equal zero and the outintensity has to equal zero. But the gravitational conformation remains. So does it remain from the place it comes from, or does it remain from the place it goes to? And which way does it go? So if it remains on one, it has to dissolve on the other. And so the substitution point is within this black hole field. We have to decide which way we're going. And again, how do we know which way we're going? We know the sequence. We can go from the atomic to the monatomic to the polyatomic to the field state, and then we can go beyond. But we can also go beyond in the other direction where we have the so-called Coulomb barrier. How can we go into the other direction? Well, there's an intensity, there's an inner space. And in that intensity, it becomes of a higher density and a convergence of forces. Where do they go? So are we just a reflection or are we an illusion? And as we are pioneering this planet, we pioneered America. And we're still pioneering America. So we have to figure out where we're going, because that's what life is all about. And so it's a big problem. Well, how big is large? And if that sounds complicated, look at the problem we're having with physics, where we have the weak nuclear forces, and they're weak because they're far away. But these far nuclear forces involve planets, and planets are big. So these weak nuclear forces have to be really, really strong. But we say the strong nuclear forces are near because they're part of the atomic structure, and we have the atomic structure here handy right within our little tiny perfect world. And so because they're near, they're actually weak. So those nuclear forces are actually weak. And so that sounds like a contradiction in terms, until we start to realize that when we bring the soul food in and we tune in, turn on, and drop out of our objections, if we provide the pattern, we get the energy. And so this energy is a convergence of the amino energy that comes together in the amino star from the oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and the hydrogen. And so getting back to the core component, we said the electron is magnetical and the neutron is gravitational. But they're both made the same way. So what's the factor? The core dependency is the factor. But, we can't tell really which one is the electron and the neutron. We kind of have to stand in the middle and ponder this. So let's ponder if there's an overlapping core dependency here. Because we know through the periodic table of elements that we have different masses. So different masses have to have different neutrons. For sure, they have different protons, and for sure, they have different electrons. So are we overlapping here? And, you know, the neutrons are bigger than the electrons. So does that work? Or do we have a core dependency where the neutron has overlapping fields and the electrons? Well, now we can account why we have more electrons. And because they're all the same charge, they stay apart. But we said that the neutron in relationship to the electron is positive, and so is the proton. So how come the negative electron does not crash into the positive neutron? And so there has to be a core consistency, and that is to compensate for the charge. The neutron has to increase its surface to volume ratio. So it actually has to be smaller, but the neutron is bigger. So the stronger nuclear force is smaller, and the weaker nuclear force is bigger. But how does the balance happen? Well, energy is always in motion. And so, like the planets and how they rotate around the sun, the electrons have a magnetical consistency. They rotate around the neutron, which harks back to my question. Is the sun our neutron? We haven't even talked about the protons in this case here. Well, what we are talking about is the core consistency, which is to say, the magnetical residue that we get is coming from the gravitational core of the universe. And the gravitational core has created the sun, has created the earth, and it has created the humanity. So there's a core consistency, which is to say, we have to take into account all the different energy transactions. So there's a possibility, if we look closely, we can have a balance between our physicality in the one energy state, but we can have a balance with the GAN state in another physical state. Which is the representation of the atomic state. Or we can have a relationship between the physical state and the plasmatic state. Or we could have a relationship between the plasmatic state of the near matter state and the plasmatic state of the universal state. And And so there has to be a core consistency in order to be able to transcend from the basis of our transmission state to the transmutation state. We know that the Earth space has done that because here we are in the beyond the Sanya conference era, where we have demonstrated the gold GANs, and that GANs has been able to manifest into the physical gold itself. And we can do that through the predictability of our understanding and maintain a consistency regardless of location. And this is true for us as well, because we can move around this planet. And so our soul has a consistency. And so it's consuming energy and absorbing energy and emitting energy consistently. And we know that that energy is coming from our soul, which has a consistency, which is coming from the universal core consistency. And so when we look at the pH of a magrav, then we have to account that the speed of rotation affects the transmutation transition, doesn't it? So it could stay on the transmission level and the transmission highway, or it could stay on the transmutation highway, and then it could come back. And so the measure of our blue planet is the balance of the intensity and the outintensity. And it happens to be in the spectrum of blue. And so we have many points of the field strength of the dove. The field strength is the potentiation layers of our emission. So we need to do more research, and the Keshe Foundation is looking to bring together the space plasma research teams. And there's continuous call out for the top scientists around the world who have the awareness and the understanding of the possibilities to bring peace and prosperity to this planet. And we as individuals have to learn the rules of the transmutation flight. And so we're in training from February to April of this year on learning how to do that. And it's a continuous process. And part of that has to be in our understanding that this has always been within our ability. But, in order to understand transmutation, we have to understand the range transition, how it transcends the inertia fields. And these inertia fields are all part of the transmutation dimensions. Every one of them is an inertia field, and the laws of conservation govern the covalent, trivalent, and tetravalent bonding attributes. So the containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. And the soul of man cannot be abandoned nor compromised. And the color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the man. This is the integrity of man. So there's an inertia unity consistency. So where the path link and susceptibility affects the emission of attention and is balanced by the emission of retention. And this interacts to create the emission of intention. So this creates a balance of the contention. the contention of equality. And so it leads us to an important conclusion here that we have to get our antennas up to get this message of feeding and this feedback manifestation. We have to tune our transmission to these transition zones, where the selection of one force is magnetical and is balanced by the force selection of another gravitational force. And the resulting selections feed the MAGRAV manifestation. So the conclusion is that the selection manifestation is predetermined. Who is doing the choosing? So your emission of intention consistently affects the standard folding deviation, leaves no room for war by choosing the peace dome of intention. And the transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. Why are we preoccupied with this? Why is this so important? Is it our responsibility to create a peace dome? Is it our responsibility to balance with the peace dome? And if we're the ones who are choosing, well, what is the alternative and why is it there? And so we've been discussing for 579 weeks in a row through the Knowledge Seekers workshops, looking for the greater oneness, the oneness of the humanity civilization. And we say that we're suddenly transcending. Is it sudden? Well, the planet's been around for billions of years. So what we've been trying to do for maybe a few thousand years in comparison is really sudden. It's a sudden transcending of the limitations of nuclear science. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science, and we're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it. Sign it. Bring about the peace dome. We're all four-wheelers in a three-dimensional feeding inertia, but there are no straight lines to connect the dots of the fields of inertia. And can man go into outer space without a peace dome? We do that every night. And is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? Who says? Well, how do we impart the transition of energy states of inertia? And that's all part of the learning, and we all have to go through that in our own way, because the inertia has consistent glitter throughout the physical transmission dimensions. So plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the peace dome in exchange for peace on earth. And that is the end of this lesson, and thank you all for enjoying. Welcome to the new outer space age.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for sharing your understanding of this. I didn't realize it was so simple, but thank you for sharing. Let's see if the participants have been prompted to raise a question. Anyone would like to come in, please? I didn't realize the creation of water was so easy. I just take a sphere and put some hydrogen gas in there and some oxygen gas, and I create water. Is that what you were saying, Alex? Why would they go through all the desalinization processes and the costs and so on to get a little bit of water when they can just create the water by mixing the hydrogen gas and the oxygen gas? Or is it that simple?
Well, we know that the burning of methane gas produces carbon dioxide and water. So we know some things, and
But I don't know if you'd get rivers of water out of that, would you? You may get some moisture, some drops, a little bit, but they're using these plants for desalinization to create rivers of water. By burning the gas, would you get such rivers?
well, if you look at the rain makes a river drop at a time, doesn't it?
Makes a whole ocean.
Exactly. So, but there are oceans that are underground. So are those oceans created exclusively from the rain, or are those oceans created the same way that oil is created, or that all the minerals are created, the copper, the gold, the zinc?
Right, but I'm saying you just take a sphere and put some hydrogen gas and some oxygen gas and you'll get water. Maybe it's a business I'd like to go into, especially in the drier parts of the world. It doesn't seem like there's much to it.
When you look at the four essentials of life, right? Clean air, clean water, clean food, and shelter. So on that basis, we could say after air, water is the next important one. And here we are in the year 2025. We still have a problem delivering water through our, municipalities to deliver clean, potable drinking water to our homes. So much so that in the United States now, with the introduction of AI and through a program written by AT&T, they have gone back to the way we delivered. Most of you are probably too young to remember when they delivered coal. They put a conveyor belt into the basement and poured the coal in, and it created quite a dust storm. I remember that because my mother was yelling at me to get out of the basement when they were doing this delivery, but I wanted to see how it got done. And it was quite exciting, but it was also quite dangerous at the time because I didn't want to get buried by all the coal coming through the window. But then we went into oil, and the oil trucks would come and deliver the oil to us and put it in a tanker. And that was in the basement. So we had to clear the area where the coal was and put in an oil tanker. Well, here today in the year 2025, we are now installing tanks for holding water. And through this app, we are able to determine when this water needs to be delivered. So we are using the same delivery system, the same plan, if you will, the same operation, just change the product that we're delivering. And, I forgot to mention one, we used to deliver milk on a regular basis to the homes as well, right? So, the milkman is gone, but the waterman is here and he's delivering to the homes. Why is he doing that? Why would someone want to have a reservoir at their home to get the water in? Well, because there's a need. And why is that need not being provided by the municipality? What's the problem? And we accept that? We accept that as normal? Really?
No, but in that instance, with the coal in the water, they're not creating any coal. They're not creating any water. They're just moving water or coal from one area to another.
And how
So
comical is that?
nobody's creating water here.
Yeah. So how comical is that? That's just an answer to your question. How modern are we? So we have basic structures. All of us have basic structures. I mean, let's face it. moonshiners were distilling whiskey, and before that, people were distilling water to purify the water, right? So, what we're doing here is distilling the knowledge. Well, if we supposedly have this knowledge, and if we supposedly have this, uh, viewpoint that we are superior, how come we're superior and we're still using ancient technology? So there's a deficiency somewhere. And, frankly, coming from Canada, we have an abundance of water, and yet we sell bottled water here. So, you're right to ask is, what's the problem? What's holding things up? Well, who do we ask? Well, we have to ask the governing bodies. We have to ask the academics. We have so many academics and so many universities. And if you ask the professors the same question that you just asked, and they come up and they say, well, I don't know. And we accept that. So we accept, well, we don't know how to do this. Well, is that true? Or is there another reason why? So what we have to determine is that why is not the question, why is the answer. And the why points us directly to the reason. And obviously that reason is hidden. Well, it's time to bring the plasma technology forward so that we can bring man not into the future, just bring him into the present. That's good enough so that we can have peace and prosperity, and that becomes our present. I hope you enjoy the gift.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to raise a point or a question while we're here? You had one slide, Alex, with was it the electron and the neutron? And you said you can see the difference, but then you moved off of that slide rather quickly. I'm not sure exactly what you were. Yeah, there you go. You can see the difference. Now, is the neutron neutral? Or sometimes it can be positive and sometimes it can be negative? I thought nu would is a reference to neutron. But you were talking the size here. You said you can see the difference. It's clear. And I wasn't able to see the difference.
Well, the difference is clear. It's completely transparent.
Oh, that's how clear it is. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you're right. The neutron is supposed to be neutral. But how can it be neutral? Because if it's neutral, that means it's a balance between the magnetical gravitational field, isn't it?
Not
So,
necessarily.
oh, really?
And I don't know how to explain that, but I just thought I'd throw that in.
Well, wait a second. If the magnetical is negative and the gravitational is positive, and you're telling me it's neutral, so it's neither magnetical, neither gravitational.
Again, I know so little about this knowledge. I'm just querying you, just
Well,
probing.
well, let's work it out. I mean, let's apply what we do know. Okay, so there is a direction. By what direction would that neutron go? And that neutron seems to want to go to the core. So what is it doing in that core? And if it's moving into that core, then it's moving from all sides, isn't it? It's not just moving from the east side or from the west side, because the earth is rotating. So if it is converging to the core, because that's the direction it's going, it's converging from all sides. So the external side of the Earth is magnetical and the core of the Earth is gravitational. So therefore, the neutron is converging towards that gravitational core. So if it's gravitating, then is the neutron negative? Because if the core is positive, then that would cause the attraction.
And again, are we delineating between the matter state of a neutron or the energy state of a neutron? Or is a neutron always an energy state?
We haven't said that.
Okay.
We haven't delineated that. We're talking as if, it's understood. It's not understood. That's why you asked the question. So,
Right. I'm trying to figure out how I got stuck on this planet.
well, yeah, exactly. So, and the neutron did it the same way. But if we understand that the neutron is rotating, then we know that the periphery of the neutron is magnetical. And if the electron is rotating, then we know the periphery of the electron is magnetical. And so in that case, that field would repel. Although the relationship between the electron and the neutron, based on surface to volume ratios, the electron would be negative and the neutron would be positive. But then you have the involvement of the proton. Well, in relationship to the neutron, the proton is negative and the neutron is positive.
Yeah, it's a little dodgy for me. I'm not saying your explanation, I'm saying my understanding is not quite there. And if I did understand it or we understood it, we could apply a lot, but can you give us any specific examples of how you've applied this in
Well,
your life or
that
in
is
our lives?
really good question. And that's what I brought up before. And that's the thing that we are first and foremost interested in because, we're not all scientists here. So, what is it that we're looking for? And really what we want to see is the practical application, isn't it? What difference does it make? Did you remember in school the teacher says, "Well, we're going to learn about this today." Let's say, we're going to learn about algebra, and you say, "Well, how's that going to put food on the table?" Or, how's that going to
Sure.
affect my life? Or, am I going to be able to have a job? My dad is a carpenter, and does he care about algebra?
Right, right.
And you say, well, what's the practical application? And the teacher would just say to you, what? Well, that's what we were supposed to teach. And you say, well, why? Well, I said, well, every time the teacher gives you an answer, you say why, and then say the answer, and then another why, and another why. So we're looking for the practical application of it. Well, the practical application comes together with the fact that we have self-serving needs. So if the municipality cannot supply water to you and you need it, it's one of the basic essentials of life. What is a person supposed to do?
Move.
And you go to the university and they say, well, we don't know. We have to do research. You go to the scientist and he tells you, well, I don't know how to make water on a large scale. Or,
Right.
um,
Right, and it's probably in a way that would again take the most of the cost out of the water, wouldn't it?
well, look at what happened in California. They didn't have the water to put the fires out, supposedly. And then how did they manufacture water? Well, Someone came and opened up the gate. So guess what? Someone invented a gate in the year 2025. Look, there's a gate. We can swing it open. Oh, there goes the water. Oh, look at that. We now have water. Well, too late. When we opened the gate to the barn, the cows all left and the horses all left. It's too late. The place is all burned down. And the day late, $1 short.
Yeah, once these things get going, I think the water would be pretty much useless once it gets out of control. But the systems within the Kesh Foundation for fire suppression using the plasmatic CO2 gas, it certainly could be contained in a relatively short time, I believe, by creating the fields, putting reactors on the current borders of any sort of blaze. But once it gets out of control, I don't think the water, it'll help a little, but it certainly cannot keep up with the raging inferno with the hurricane winds.
Well, that's another factor. But you were just asking me for the production of water. So in order to produce the water in California, someone had to invent a gate and open the gate. It's ridiculous. Okay. That's a ridiculous answer that I give you. But we've come to accept that as being acceptable.
So Ike, go ahead. I see your mic came open.
Alex, there was water. Those conspiracy from Trump people. Some of the water has to they shut they down because of flooding for farmers. So it was some of them that was not operational. They have it as on schedule. So during that time, those water cannot be, because that will flood some of the farms. And then when the fire happened, they still have to get authorization to get it out. So it's not like there was no water in California. So Trump, they capitalized on it. And then when they ordered to turn it on, the farmers lost a lot. So it's all working on this part and then creating havoc on the other one. So it wasn't there was no water. It's all lies from Trump and his folks.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is that the farms in California produce about 25% of the crops that we distribute throughout North America. So what happened in California had a tremendous impact throughout the whole continent. And, what I'm alluding to is the fact that it was important. And I've often said, well, if important is not important, then, what is important? And providing food, for the continent, which depends on providing water to grow the food, then all of the management of these resources is what becomes important. And here we are not able to adjust ourselves properly to handle all the conditions. In other words, we did not have what we needed to be able to produce on demand. And yet we are so educated. And, there is one thing that is true. The cost per student in the US is number one. And in the survey of 40 countries, we are the 40th. So, we're not getting we're not getting value for our money, are we? And that's not a political statement. That's just a fact of reality. So, you know, we have needs, and we're not addressing them. The fundamental needs of the clean air, clean water, and clean food are fundamental. They need to be taken care of first. So if you're in the disaster zone, these are the first three things that you think about. You don't think about, you know, the poker game on the weekend, or you don't think about the spread in the football game, you know, or how your stock is doing on the stock market. You don't care about stuff like that. You're caring about life essentials, and those life essentials should be taken care of at the beginning. It's not something to be delayed for, you know, down the road and say, well, you know, one of these days we're going to learn how to produce water on demand the way nature produces it.
So how do you produce water? Is it, we see when you burn methane? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
Yeah, but that's in the
byproduct
matter
water.
state. That's in the physical state.
right.
So to convert the methane, you need to give an external force, and that external force is a flame. So now you're consuming the methane, and what you're doing is converting it from one physical state into another physical state.
But
And,
methane is poisonous.
what is poisonous?
Methane, isn't it CH4? I understand it's poisonous. Methane is it's a poisonous gas. Is it true?
Well, it's well, like carbon dioxide is poisonous as well, if that would be true. And yet you exhale carbon dioxide, so that means there is carbon dioxide in your lungs, and so that begs the question is how come we don't poison ourselves by exhaling?
But
Exactly.
not in the plasmatic state. The CO2 is not.
Yeah, well, we're not talking about the plasmatic state. You know, Ike was asking me about the physical
Okay.
state
Yep.
regarding
Yep.
Right.
methane. So therefore, what the two of you have come to the conclusion that there are different properties of the methane in the physical state and in the plasmatic state.
Correct.
Okay,
Right.
so now we have that understanding. So we are not rocket scientists. So how come rocket scientists, you know, are having trouble with this? And this becomes the big question. Like, what are they doing? Why are they? You know, it's not even a matter of money, because what they're doing is enormously expensive. So, you know, it's not happening for us. And
Right.
we're looking for a practical application. Well, it's nice, you know, you go off and you know, you're demonstrating your rocket capability, and you know, for practical purposes, well, we get to demonstrate our rocket capability on the 4th of July and on New Year's, right? And we can have a light show by firing off these rockets, which of course cost money, you know, and yet we can't seem to provide for our seniors, and we can't provide for our street urchins, and you know, for people who have fallen in hard times. You know, our social security is not very secure, and so this becomes the question: why? And so when you look at that result and you say, well, it doesn't make sense. So it doesn't make sense to you because you're looking at it from a practical point of view, but someone else is looking at it from a different practical point. It's their practical point of view. So if we are looking at it from the point of humanity as a civilization, and we're finding there's an opposition to that, then the other point of view, by default, is the point of view of the humanity uncivilization. That's the point.
And of course, the Oasis system will produce water, but I don't know if it can fill a reservoir. But it would certainly devastate the bottled water industry, because then you would be bottling your own water at home. Pristine. You know, the Oasis system will create the food, energy, gas, and water for your needs.
So the rate of change is going to be the main factor here.
In other words, how quickly this can be brought in,
Right.
that rate of change.
Yeah.
Okay, any other good questions? Or even if it's an intermediate question, I think Alex would like it. When you mentioned about the pairs, what did you say about the pairs when you show they come in pairs? There was one of your
The
backgrounds.
gases come in pairs. Hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen comes in pairs.
So when we have the Cohen, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, is that a pair? The N or no,
yeah.
I'm just thinking, or are they all connected as a pair of nitrogen because they basically all came out of the nitrogen?
Okay, so you have to split the pairs, don't you?
I didn't know there was a pair. I
Yeah,
thought
yeah.
it was carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen.
Well, yeah, it's the one half of the pair. If you split the pair, it's no longer a pair, is it?
And this is being done in the upper atmosphere. Yes?
Yes. And it's also being done in the inner atmosphere of your body.
Okay. And in the atmosphere, as he said, we're protein breathers. But I wasn't familiar with this pairing.
Yeah, there's no such thing as oxygen on its own. It's O2. Hydrogen is H2 and nitrogen is N2. So if you were to create a nitrogen gas, you can create a nitrogen pair with oxygen. Or you could create a nitrogen bond with 2 oxygen or 3 oxygen. You can also create a nitrogen with a hydrogen. So the question then becomes is, why would the nitrogen bond with hydrogen, or why would the nitrogen bond with oxygen? What's the difference? And how does that happen? So this is just basic inertia. And, we're not, scientists. So the reason that this is happening has to do with a greater understanding. And we're not concerned as individuals with that. We're concerned about the practical application of that. So the practical application is that we are eating and we are drinking. The fact of the matter is that the eating and the drinking are literally the same thing, because we drink to absorb energy and we eat to absorb energy. Well, don't we sleep to absorb energy? So where does that come from? Because we're not drinking and we're not eating while we're sleeping, but we are breathing. So maybe we are breathing energy, drinking energy, and eating energy. What's the difference? And so this is where the practical application has to come to the foreground. This needs to be the paramount discussion of each and every family. These are the things that we need to take care of. And by delegating that responsibility to the municipality, There's nothing wrong with that because we have, the sharing of the resources, if you will. Instead of each of us having it individually, we can have a collective, coming to that together and contributing. It's just like if you are wanting to eat, you want variety. So you buy cucumbers from one farm, you buy lettuce from another farm, you buy carrots from another farm. And so you bring it all together. So the other way to do it is you grow the cucumber, you grow the lettuce, and you grow the carrot. Okay. Well, do you have the knowledge and the resources to do all of that? And, if you're hungry and it takes 8 weeks to grow lettuce, or maybe we could grow it even faster in 4 weeks, can you last for 4 weeks without eating?
You better resort to sprouting at that point. You'll have something in a few days. Or better yet, take advantage of the feeding system that's in the Keshe Foundation store. As we understand from the teachings, we're already absorbing 80% of the energies we need by default. That's our default position. It's only the 20% that we're short of. And this is what these products are helping us bridge, I think.
So it's unfair that this 20% is consuming most of our time.
A lot of our thinking, yes, go ahead, Randy.
And when you plant your garden, make sure you plant it in a way that the natural bugs will keep one bug away from one plant and another plant, because there are methods to do that. And I met some farmers here last year that are teaching people how to plant their gardens so that naturally no pesticides, nothing is needed. The bugs that are naturally there in the soil keep the other bugs away from the other plants. There are ways to do that to produce real organic vegetables.
Yeah, and that was a nice example Mr. Keshe gave in China, how they bring in these hundreds of thousands of ducks to go through a field when things get out of control, pests or other things. Not only do they take care of the pests, but they also fertilize as they're working. And this is an old way of controlling, as he said, but they're still using it apparently in certain places.
And then let's get back to the oxygen-hydrogen mix for a second. When divers go past a certain point, they only need helium and oxygen. They don't require nitrogen. Has to do with pressures and stuff in the lungs. And I guess if you don't have the right mix, things are not good. So again, we're feeding different things. And, the sun is the sun hydrogen based? I think it's helium based. So we're getting that too, but in a different way.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Anyone else want to make a comment or a question or a suggestion or something that's perhaps not on the topic but related to the technology? Don't feel you're going to be wrong or offend anyone. We're all in nursery school, so to speak.
Well, I think this is great. We've had tremendous involvement from the panelists, fabulous questions. And isn't this the thing that we've wanted to ask our parents, or we wanted to ask our teachers? And, this is not the average conversation that you find, among the youth. I'm a member of one Telegram channel of university students. And university students are supposedly students who are pursuing a higher education, and they don't talk about this. They talk about the same stuff that, students in grade 9 talk about. And say, well, why are these students from the higher education not, benefiting in a practical manner from their education. They're not seeing the connection. Well, we do have a connection. We understand. We've gone through life and seen that the quality of our life has diminished. You may not see it from day to day unless there's a coup. But, you know, if you look back, and you don't have to go far, even you know, 20 years ago, life was better. Life was not as complex, but life was not as harsh. Life was better. And for some people, they are oblivious to the changes because in their life, they made more money, and that brings them a level of stability. Well, that's fine, but that's a small percentage of the population. The vast majority of the population is living from day to day, not even week to week, but day to day. And many have dropped out of society. They have, you know, worked on they have found that the criminal element is making more money, and money is what it's about. Money is what makes the world go round. And that's their practical understanding. They're not interested in, you know, creating plasma energy. And yet they are plasma themselves. And so what are they doing? They are experiencing their belief, and they believe that money makes the world go round. So that's what they focus on. They're missing the show. But they're not contributing to the answer, they're contributing to the problem. And what are the video bloggers doing? They're doing the same thing. They are collecting all the damage into a file and transmitting it, regurgitating it in the absence of a solution. And so that becomes the difference. If you're looking for consistency, if you're going to identify a problem, then you have to come forward with a solution. But there's certain people who feel that if you manufacture a problem, then you can manufacture the solution. Well, do we need a make work project? Is that what we really need? Or do we need, wait a second, it's the year 2025 and we still have the inability to deliver clean food and clean water? And why is that not our top priority? Why is that not every government's top priority? Thank you all for allowing me to continue to present. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and we will be here for any more questions. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, great. It's like you've probably heard this one before. The child asks the father, you know, Dad, why is the sky blue? And the father thinks about it for a moment and he said, well, son, it's because God likes blue. But imagine, and that's the answer. But imagine if you introduce the child to the idea of nitrogen and how that has an effect in the color of what we see. I believe it's the nitrogen and so forth. And starting a child at an early age, understanding this process of creation, and that there's more to it than God wanted the sky blue because he likes blue. So this is beautiful the way this knowledge is getting opened up, and it's with a surety. Again, it's not waffling on this knowledge. It's quite sure, and they can show it as they're doing on the graphs with the soul and the transmutation and the rest. So imagine starting a child at an early age, starting to understand this process of creation. They'll have a whole different outlook and mature in a totally different way and see the world totally different. Anyone else want to raise a point or a question or interject something here?
Well, I just want to interject one thing, Mark, on the matter of consistency. 579 weeks of delivering the Knowledge Seekers workshops is a tremendous feat, and we were not looking to do this as a goal. We were looking to teach for practical purposes, and so for 579 weeks, for many, it seems that we are suddenly talking about this. Well, it's only suddenly compared to how long we haven't been talking about this, or if we have, you know, we've kept it to ourselves in our own private little tiny little perfect world. But our tiny perfect world affects other worlds. That's the reality of the plasma energy. That's the reality of the inertia fields. So where are these other fields and how is that working? So those are the questions we need to be asking. And it's only because it's hard to get the answers that most of us give up and then go through life without getting that answer. And that's actually not right, because otherwise one could come to the conclusion that life is purposeless.
Exactly.
And
Yep.
it boggles the mind if you say, well, there's no purpose in life.
Or there's no answers. The answer is what you want it to be.
Sure.
Okay, any other comments, questions, additions, combinations, reductions? I'm just going to play the final disclaimer and the meeting will come to an end, but I just thought we'd show the three wise men and of course let me just share the screen.
Take her away.
Of the three wise men, which again, we thought these were matter state gifts being brought to the new child in Bethlehem. But as Mr. Kesh said, most of the Christians missed it, including myself. And these gifts were the idea of thinking good, speaking good, and acting good. And this is what we need to apply individually on our own. And only you can control that. I don't think anyone else can go inside you and force you to change anything. But I think the thinking, speaking, and acting good creates a beautiful shielding for you. Just an example of blood pressure. By thinking good and speaking good about something maybe that's negative in your life or something bad that's happened to you, you'll keep your blood pressure. The emotions can create so much. As Mr. Kesh keeps saying, the emotions are the key. And as you continue to find ways to think good and speak good and act good, this other little keychain comes in to work in a way. And may you be proud of the work you do. And may you be proud of the person you are, and may you be proud of the difference you're making being in and around this technology. But this is part of the ethos of the Kesh Foundation, or the ethos of Mitra. And I know Mr. Kesh said that there'll be more teaching in the future, and this will come from the daughter of Mitra, which has been given this knowledge. But it's her job to, again, enlighten you even further, even though the universal teacher could do that, but this will be Mitra's position. But again, no words, just coming through the energy dimension. So I want to thank you all for continuing to hang in there. And again, unfortunately, the worldwide announcement has been delayed, but it's not forgotten. And I'm sure Mr. Kesh has another plan or another plan on top of that. As he said, this plan has been written centuries ago. So the feebleness of man will not outsmart the knowledge and what has been planned already by the universal community. So we will see the change, and hopefully it'll start to perk up in 2025 at some point in time. I think there'll be another big surprise, but we won't get disheartened. As he said, we realize that other things are being set for the future for a reason. There's a reason for all this, and the main one is that humanity is not collectively ready to manifest this. So we continue to, again, elevate the others, including our, in that process, you get elevated, and continue to share the knowledge as best we can with our shallowness of understanding at this point. But it will grow. It's growing every day. And it's much, much further along than before we were aware of the Keshe Foundation and the teachings within the Keshe Foundation. So I want to thank you all again for being here.